2, 3, 4.
The Beatles, the fabbest of four there ever were, released their seventh studio album, Revolver, in 1966. And it was a watershed moment in rock history. It came at a time of great change musically and saw the Beatles transcend from teen idols into revolutionaries, and with this helped change the face of popular music forever. By 66, the group had become a bit dissatisfied with the overall sound. They felt they didn't quite have the same impact sonically as the American records they adored, especially those coming from Detroit and the Motown label. The main gripe was the lack of impact and bass in the recordings. Paul was after more presence in the low end, and John's insistence for thunderous drums led to main engineer of the record Geoff Emerick to experiment with his mic placement, moving the mics right up to the drum heads, earning him an EMI reprimand for microphone abuse.
The rulings there were the fact you weren't supposed to put the bass drum mic closer than 18 inches to the bass drum, and I took it about 4 inches away from the front, and someone sort of snitched on me, and so the next day I was in trouble, and there was a sort of meeting with management, and in fact, in the end, I got a letter giving me permission to be able to do that on Beatles sessions.
The basic setup for the drum kit was the AKG D19C for a single overhead. The D19 was a good quality dynamic mic that Abbey Road happened to have an abundance of. The modern equivalent would be something like a Shure SM57. The bass drum was mic'd with the AKG D20, and a third mic, the Neumann KM56, was placed underneath the snare. And this blend was then balanced through the EMI RS144 four-way submixer into the Red 51 console. At the beginning of this era, Emerick, along with another prominent Abbey Road engineer, Ken Townsend, experimented by taking one of the monitor speakers and reverse wiring it as a microphone in order to record Paul's bass amp. He also dedicated a whole track to the bass on the recording of Rain, and only a backing vocal accompanied it on Paperback Writer. While the experiment proved fruitful as it was stark how much more powerful the bass was on the record, this sound could be more attributed to Geoff Emerick's liberal use of compression. Geoff had just made the transition from disc cutting and knew just how much volume and bass could be squeezed onto a record, and managed to create the template for a more aggressive and thunderous sound that the band desired. The key to all this was the use of the Fairchild 660 compressor and the EMI RS124 compressor. With regards to the Fairchild, it added a lot of presence, Emerick says. Even if you just plug it in and use its circuitry, it sounded like the best tube amp ever. It was an earlier visit to Capitol Records that persuaded EMI to invest in several units for themselves. They also utilised the EMI invention, Automatic Transient Overload Control, or ATOC. With this, they were able to add extra bass. The Abbey Road Studios website recalls that this allowed mastering engineer Tony Clark to cut the Beatles' Paperback Writer with an extremely high bass factor without causing the needle on a record player to jump. The RS124 was an EMI modified Ultec 436B. This was known as Abbey Road's secret weapon as it wasn't commercially available in its modified form, and can be heard all over the Beatles recordings of this time. It wasn't uncommon for them to track with it, bounce down and even master with it, so in essence using it in triplicate, which has a massive effect on the overall sound. Few pieces of gear define music history as the RS124 does. It was the secret weapon of Abbey Road engineers during the 60s, favoured by Geoff Emerick for punchy bass sounds, by Ken Scott for lush guitar treatment, for Norman Smith for lightly gluing the entire rhythm bus. The RS124 was also a popular choice for mastering in Abbey Road's cutting rooms. The sound is especially famous for the thick, creamy bass tones, and the engineers would typically push the input of the RS124 deep into the 15 to 20 dB of gain reduction, producing wonderfully lush results on numerous sources. Other aspects that affected the evolving sound were their instruments. It's at this time that Paul shifted away from recording with his trusty Hofner and started using mainly a Rickenbacker 4001S. New guitars for the session included Harrison's recently acquired 1964 Gibson SG Standard, his main guitar for Revolver, and Lennon and Harrison's Sunburst Epiphone Casinos. For the guitar amps, the boys had an upgrade from their usual AC30s and acquired the UL 7120s with built-in fuzz circuits. You can hear them in full tilt on songs such as Angel Bird Can Sing and She Said, She Said. A Fender Showman was also added to the lineup, and apparently George would also appropriate the cream-coloured Fender Bassman for use with his guitar. Paul's bass amp of choice at this time was either the Fender Bassman or the Vox UL 4120. The recording medium, of course, was tape at this time and limited to 4 tracks on the Studio J37. This meant for the most part laying down a backing track of drums, bass and rhythm guitar on track 1, and then subsequent overdubs from there. This seems incredibly limited by today's standards, and it meant they had to get it right from the start of the process. They did do tape reduction on Revolver, where they would consolidate multiple tracks into one or two new tracks on a fresh 4-track machine to free up space for more parts if needed. Once all the recordings were complete, those 4 tracks would then be mixed down to a master recorder, primarily mono as this was still the main consumer format of the day, and later quickly in stereo. The main mastering recorder was the BTR2, or the big green tape machine as it was known. For EQ and tonal shaping at both the tracking and mixing stage, Abbey Road had another secret weapon given the name the Curve Bender. Designed in 1952 by Mike Batchelor, it was the world's first parametric equalizer and completely passive in design, meaning it required no power. It was initially intended for the disc cutting rooms, but sometimes made its way down to the recording studios, if special permission was granted. The unit was tremendously more powerful than the comparatively primitive Red mixing console. Another bit of kit was the EMI RS92 Neumann mic equalizer. Some believe it cuts the boomy low end and drops the 8K peak found in the Neumann large diaphragm mics. The final piece of equipment of note was the RS127 presence box built in-house by Abbey Road engineers in the 1960s. Because the Red consoles were limited in their onboard EQ, these boxes were designed to solve this problem. EMI engineers built the presence box offering 10 decibels of cut or boost at 2.7K, 3.5K and 10K. These units were in constant operation throughout the studios during recording and mixing, even finding their way into the cutting rooms. Despite being an incredible singer, John was never too happy with hearing his voice and often wanted to sound different in some way. When it came to recording Tomorrow Never Knows, he proclaimed that on this record he should sound like the Dalai Lama singing from a Tibetan mountaintop. In the end, patching his mic through a rotating Leslie speaker cabinet gave him enough of a thrill, and certainly safer than spinning him around a microphone on a rope, which was bizarrely an actual suggestion. Another trick to get his voice to sound different was a process called artificial double tracking, or ADT for short. The standard practice of double tracking, whereby you would just record the voice again carefully in time, took a lot of skill and time to do. Ken Townsend thought about this and brilliantly came up with a system involving 2 different tape machines. The first fed a signal to the output as normal, but also a signal from its record head to another machine that speed was controlled by a dial. Blending these 2 signals together while moving the speed dial created a really interesting phase effect that John Lennon loved and used quite often. Revolver saw the Beatles' first experimentation with tape loop. The track Tomorrow Never Knows was a direct inspiration from the world of avant-garde music made by the likes of Karlheinz Stockhausen, and a far cry from Herman's Hermits and Jerry and the Pacemakers. The drums themselves were part of a 2-bar drum loop. They were even sampling whole musical parts, as the brass band featured in Yellow Submarine was taken from the EMI Sound Effects tape volume 46, containing the song Le Rêve Passe. Backwards guitar makes its debut also in this era, and most notably on I'm Only Sleeping, which sets the tone for psychedelic flavours to come. For most mortals, a lot of these tools are far too unique to get your hands on, unless you hire Abbey Road, or in the case of the Fairchild, of at least 5k to spare for a copy, or at least 40k for the real thing. Luckily, there have been a few plugins released over the years that emulate these almost priceless bits of kit, so we can experiment and see how close we can get to this sound. The main pieces have been emulated by Waves, and their Abbey Road pack includes the desk, the Red 51, the Curve Bender with the RS56, the RS124 compressor, and the Puig Child, which is a Fairchild from the Jack Joseph Puig collection. The tape is in the form of the J37. The reverb chambers are also available in this pack. Softtube provide the presence box, and Acoustic have released the Cream 2 plugin, which aims to be a one-stop shop for the signal flow, emulating the BTR2 tube preamp, which I'll use on my master bus. It also has the presence boxes and the RS124, so I'm going to interchange with the Waves version, as apparently no 2 versions of the RS124 ever sounded alike, even in the Beatles days, so it'd be good to hear the different flavours. For the vocal processing, I'm going to use the Waves ADT plugin in a section, plus a simulated Leslie cabinet from the Pro Tools plugin DB33. In the first instance, we need some drums. I'm going to use the Abbey Road 60s drums, as it boasts a vintage Ludwig kit and importantly the acoustics of Abbey Road Studio 2. I'm going to have 1 overhead plus kick and snare. For the bass, I don't have a Rickenbacker, but I do have a Hofner, so I'm going to use this through the BX Bassman emulation. For the guitars, I do have a version of an SG for the lead and a semi-hollow Gibson Epiphone style to approximate the Casino. I'm using the Amplitude plugin for the Vox. This diagram is a simplified approximation of the recording flow. It doesn't include all the bouncing they did, although this was primarily because of the restrictions of 4-track, so it isn't something we have to worry about in Pro Tools. It did have an effect on the sound quality, of course, as they introduced multiple stages of tape recording that would progressively hinder the fidelity of the original sound. This doesn't represent one particular song, but rather an average of how it would have been done at the time of Revolver. As mentioned before, the key is the multiple stages of compression and the nature of it. Jeff recalls being quite heavy-handed with it, and it's evident when you listen to the drums. The cymbals have a sustain that is a telltale sign of heavy compression, as it was applied up to 3 times during the recording and mixing process. To get this heavy compressed sound with the Fairchild, we can switch the time constant knob to a fast attack and slow release by turning it to the left to find the desired sweet spot, and the threshold knob to the right for a good level for the compression to start being applied. With the RS-124, the controls are quite basic also. The auto hold feature reduces compression artifacts when loud attacks are encountered during silence, or when low-level noise is boosted due to long release times. The recovery control sets the release time of the compressor. This is the time taken for the compressor to recover from a state of compression to normal gain, when the signal dips below the threshold. It is controlled by the 6-position switch, where 1 is fast and 6 is slow. For mastering, it also has a cutter mode which switches it to have a lower attack time, making it less grabby and more suitable for the mix bus, or in the Beatles days the final cutting room stage. This Waves version also has a super fuse mode, which sets the release time to the attack time, creating a brutal compression character that sounds like it's fighting against itself. I really like this setting and it brings out a lot of character in whatever sound you're processing. Here it is on the snare. Before I play my attempt at trying to create a similar sounding track with these plugins, here are a few elements in isolation to demonstrate what they were doing in the track and how the engineers back in '66 would have been using them.